So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Maria Kokori, Research Fellow at the Art Institute, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the Professor Monica Amor's lecture. The lecture is part of the Modern Contemporary Materiality series at the Art Institute, generally funded by the Stockman Family Foundation. From today to the spring of 2018, the Art Institute will host 4 lectures paired with scholar workshop discussions on specific topics that impact our understanding on modern and contemporary materialities today. The series will culminate in an object-based Art History Scholars' Day in spring 2018, but will draw together the various threads of discussion advanced over the course of the year. The event considers some of the broad issues and ideas associated with the concept of materiality, and it aims to provide the opportunity to engage much broader section of the visual profession into dialogue, most crucially artists, art historians, curators, conservators, and scientists. The cross-disciplinary dialogue will address questions such as, can materiality foster a new method for thinking about art, and what is its place in art history studies? What models do material studies have to offer that could address ontological issues while also engaging with questions of aesthetics, politics, or social history? Does the materiality of art objects have new import in the 21st century globalized art world, or how might its implication to be changing? Can the ever-expanding focus on global practice offer us new modes of understanding materiality and how it engages with audiences? And of course, after lunch with Monica and a discussion in the morning, I have more questions, which are increasing, perhaps rather than decreasing, the complexity. But I hope this series is going to stimulate plenty of thought-provoking discussion. This is not the first event to deal with materiality in modern and contemporary art, nor is likely to be the last, and it's also not the first time that scientists and conservators have met with curators and art historians to discuss some of these topics. But I hope that the format of these events, consisting of very focused discussions, will foster the kind of dialogue that will move the curatorial, conservation, and art historian fields forward. It's a great pleasure to introduce Monica Amor. Monica is professor of modern and contemporary art at the Maryland Institute College of Art. She has contributed to publications such as Art Forum, Nexus, Grey Room, October, Third Text, and Art Margins. She has also curated a number of exhibitions, including Altering History, Alternating Stories for the Museum de Bellas Artes de Caracas, Beyond the Document for the Reina Sofia in Madrid, Gecko-Defining Structures for the Sir Alves Foundation in Porto, and Mexico Expected Unexpected for La Maison Rouge in Paris. Her most recent books, Theory of the Non-Object, Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela, 1944-1969, published in 2016 by University of California Press, investigates the crisis of the sculptural and painterly object in the concrete, neo-concrete, and constructivist practices of artists in Argentina, Brazil, and Venezuela. Based on deep archival research, this wonderful book brings scholarly attention to a group of major art figures, including Lygia Clark, Elio Tisica, and Gego, and some of the works discussed in her book were on display recently at the exhibition Elio Tisica at the Art Institute. Exploring the philosophical, economic, and political underpinnings of geometric abstraction in post-Second World War in South America, Monica's books highlights the overlapping inquiries of artists and critics who worked on the periphery of European and US modernism, thus contributing to a sophisticated conversation about the nature of the art object, their materiality or non-materiality. I would like to specially thank the Stockman Family Foundation for generally supported the Modern Contemporary Materialities lecture and workshop series, Francesca Casadio and Jill Bugalski, of course, the co-organizers of these events, Ann Goldstein, Sarah Guernsey, and Frank Giucari, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Thanks are also due to many colleagues who provided support and encouragement, and Jan Trujillo for her support in organization of the event, and Il Yang for audio-visual support. So again, my thanks to Monica Amor and to all of you for attending what we hope to be an important and enjoyable event. And without further delay, I would like to welcome up onto the podium Professor Monica Amor. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thanks to Maria Kokori, Jill Bukashki, I'm mispronouncing, and Jan Trujillo for her diligent arrangement of my trip. As you might see from the title of my talk, the issue of materialities might seem a little elusive here. And I put some pressure on Maria in a recent email, asking her, Maria, what do you mean exactly by materialities, and what do you aim to achieve with these talks? And she talked in her email about material culture, the turn to material culture, the attention we've been putting in the last years and decades actually to material culture. But she's also interested in an exchange between artists and curators, and overlaps in between disciplines. I also caught my attention her interest in broadening in general the question of objects. So I hope to speak to some of these issues, hopefully not in a too elusive or tangential or oblique way. But let me start by saying that, yes, the non-object is a concept that I've been working on for many years. I borrowed the term from a famous essay by poet Ferreira Goulart, who wrote in 1959 a short essay called The Theory of the Non-Object. And so I'll talk about the non-object today, which is the material that concerns this book that Maria mentioned. What I've been trying to do since I published the book last year is I've been trying to think about the non-object as a generative model, not so much as a regional, merely local operation that pertains to post-war Brazilian art, but try to think about it as a generative model that may allow us to map an alternative trajectory of artistic production, both post-war and contemporary. So bear with me. Hopefully this is not too speculative, but that's what I'm going to attempt today. In 2014, French artist Philippe Parreno stated, "Art unframes and ruptures the meaning of what we usually see or hear, allowing it to speak an outside voice," end quote. 55 years before, and thousands of miles away, Brazilian poet Ferreira Goulart defined the non-object as an artistic event that, through its spatio-temporal complexity, rejected the frame and the base, those pictorial and sculptural markers that establish the boundaries of more conventional works of art, works that we associate with the production of objects and their insertion in appropriate exhibition spaces. My talk today will try to bridge inquiries posed around form, the art object, and the space of the museum in works produced in Brazil in the context of neoconcretism, 1959-1961, and a more recent rejection of the production of discrete objects in favor of the notion of the exhibition as medium. For these, I will focus on the work of Philippe Parreno, whose appropriation of the concept quasi-object, which he borrows from philosopher Michel Serret, echoes Brazilian poet Ferreira Goulart's own non-object. The aim of my talk today is twofold. I want to foreground the non-object as an alternative proposition for the all-encompassing presence of the specific object, i.e. minimalism, in the formulation of most histories of contemporary art, from site specificity to institutional critique to performance. And if you look at any number of survey publications, or in general the literature on contemporary art, be that on focusing on institutional critique, performance, or site specificity, most of this literature sees minimalism as sort of the sort of beginning point of contemporary art. So I want to posit the non-object as generative and not definitional. This dovetails with another premise, that modernity is not exclusive, it's not an exclusive Euro-American narrative that was exported abroad through colonization and globalization, but that otherness is constitutive to modernity. This otherness is not merely geographic and pertains propositions that we consider anathema to modern art, such as, for example, the synthesis of the arts, about which you never encounter in schools and programs, never was taught. In courses in modern and contemporary art, it was clearly anathema to the whole concept of medium specificity. Or in the case of the art object, the rejection of medium specificity that the non-object represents. By unframing the art object, the non-object becomes a paradigmatic proposition that serves as a model discursive intervention. To wit, the non-object, I will argue, is not merely a local operation at the edge of modernity, but a central conceptual device that facilitates our attempt at a post-war global cultural enterprise. And this will be echoed in my elliptical approach to the materiality of the object, as I will be concerned mainly with its instability and not its ontology. Materials will matter, but not as a definitional core. Maybe against recent turns towards the object, I want to suggest, following Michel Serret, for material objects that mark positions, making subject and object unstable, ontologically unstable. But let me go back to Brazil. I borrowed the non-object, as I already said, from a short text written in 1959 by Brazilian poet Ferreira Goulart. He published this short essay in the cultural supplemento of the Rio de Janeiro paper, Jornal do Brasil, to which he contributed regularly as an art critic. In it, Goulart addressed the work of the neo-concrete artist he was supporting at the time and with whom he had written the Neo-Concrete Manifesto, published earlier. What happened? I didn't mean to promote, so blatantly that my book, which I did in a previous talk for different reasons, but I erased that image. I don't know what's doing there. Anyways, I know you're not believing me, but anyway, that's the cover of my book. Yes. So I borrowed the non-object. I did erase for my book. I had erased that sentence. So anyway, for my book, I borrowed the non-object from a short text written in 1959 by Brazilian poet Ferreira Goulart. And so he was supporting the work of neo-concrete artists, Oiticica being, of course, one of them. And I hope that everybody got to enjoy the beautiful and amazing Oiticica show that I couldn't see because I couldn't get here yesterday as I planned originally. They published the Neo-Concrete Manifesto earlier that year of 1959, previously to the theory of the non-object. The non-object addressed works by a group of geometric abstract artists whom had dismissed the sculptural base and the pictorial frame. That's what he distinctly identifies in this body of work. He looked at the work, in this essay, he looked at the work of the Soviet avant-garde, Malevich and Tatlin specifically, for antecedents in which the work operated in real space, integrated itself into the architecture beyond, again, the definitional markers of the base and the frame, thus activating a temporal dimension emphasized by the insertion of the work in the real space shared by the viewer. The non-object, from within a careful analysis of the limits of abstract representation, to wit, Goulart criticized the concrete idea that painting is self-sufficient and refers to nothing but itself, burst open paradigms there to modernist art and modernism in general. And these paradigms are medium specificity, the frame, the plane, the white cube, contemplation, originality, linearity, but also notions of a correspondence between socioeconomic progress and advanced art, democracy, and public sphere. Back in 2004, I invoked Niklas Luhmann's systems theory to support the idea that modernity is inherently discontinuous and incomplete, and that our narratives of modernity are markings in an unmarked space and thus establish boundaries between marked and unmarked states. Additionally, these markings are produced by an observer who can't see him, herself observing, establish, that is, distinctions and boundaries. This paradox is perceived by a second observer, for whom those boundaries and marks might not be natural or necessary, but artificial and contingent. As Luhmann observed, quote, when we go back to the traditional definition of paradoxes as going beyond the limit of common sense, the immediate intention seems to be to deframe and reframe the frame of normal thinking, the frame of common sense. End quote. Like the frame of painting, our history is produced within limits that assert the ontology of the discipline. Get rid of the frame, deframe and reframe, and the temporal contingency, fluxes, and uncertainty rush in to facilitate interfaces between historical and aesthetic structures, or knotted intersections between disciplines, the solution which opens up new possibilities for experimentation. And here, the non-object and the reticle meet, avoiding the limitations of form with its clearly delimited inside and its outside. The reticle dismisses form, hierarchies, and fixed boundaries. Neither the non-object nor the reticle reproduce themselves as form, quote, as an entity with a boundary, with an inside and an outside. We might want to argue, or we might want to gog the implications of a model of production that refuses to settle, which defies, again, ontology and categorization, and instead favors relations, or the space in between, spaces of transformation where one gives up, quote, the comforts of disciplinary specialism and risk putting oneself into perpetual translation, end quote. That's Spencer Brown. In 2004, as I said, I zoom into the role of the observer inside Gego's Reticularia, which you are seeing on the screen. And this work, I'm going to make a little aside on materiality. It's made of iron and aluminum, but mostly florist wire that used back in the 60s to make florist arrangements, and it was very malleable. And Gego would make these little loops at the end of these rods to facilitate connection and connectivity. And so it was like a weaving process. And as you can see, the nets are of different sizes and different configurations. So back in 2004, I'm trying to follow these kind of sort of methodological a model that I tried to discern from my looking and reading and thinking about the reticularia, right? So I zoom into the role of the observer inside Gego's Reticularia, which highlighted the operation of observation itself, and most photographs of the Reticularia from this period always feature observers inside the work. So I argue that it highlights the operation of observation itself, the observer in operation. Form-narrative, in other words, is a result of drawing distinctions between form and environment, and these are performed by an observer. Thus, these or that form is not, meaning that there's no final identity, because, again, it's based on depends on the contingency of the observer. Moreover, a center-periphery logic in which the center is the privileged term of the binary implies a structure of authority based on the traditional assumption that the world is ontologically describable and definable. But categories are now distinctions, and under this regime of marked and unmarked spaces, the non-object could be thought as the ocean of indistinction and de-differentiation from which the object, form, emerges with apparent clarity, but awashed in contingency. The non-object is the noise, the background, the medium from where loose coupling of elements, of materials, give shape to a surplus of possibilities. Not surprisingly, the object, as theorized by Goulart, bore the impact of Husserlian phenomenology. He wrote, "The non-object, unique in our phenomenal world, is conducive to the suspension of knowledge and to the experience of astonishment because it is free from the attachments to the worlds of language and use." So this is an important formulation about the non-object. He which is why he called it non-object. It's dissociated from painting, it's dissociated from sculpture, there's no base, there's no frame. And these are, by the way, Goulard's examples, illustrations in the Supplemento. So you have an early work by Lydia Clark, you have suprematist architecture by Malevich, Tattling relief, and Mondrian, Duchamp, and etc. So these are the works he's looking at, and he's saying these are non-objects. They're not painting, they're not sculpture, but they're not. Also, they are not everyday objects, right? Which is why Duchamp could never produce non-objects. The non-object instead is this, thing that appears in our phenomena, that we encounter phenomenologically, that is divorced from language, from use, and thus creates this experience of astonishment. Again, he's influenced by Husserl and by Merleau-Ponty. But so let me try to pursue this figure of de-differentiation and undefinition that Goulard posites. Let's remember that Goulard argued that the non-object was inspired by a work of Lydia Clark, a member of the Neo-Concrete group, that he later described as a dismembered picture. So language here is interesting and important. He also called this work troço, which is Portuguese slang meaning an undefined thing, something, stuff. It is unclear which specific work triggered these terms, but by October of 1959, Clark had embarked in a series of works that Goulard identified in the press as evading the qualities of traditional mediums, not painting, not relief, not sculpture. And those are his words from a review that he wrote in the paper. And in this essay, Goulard focused, but in the essay, in Theory of the Non-Object, Goulard focused on the role of the frame. The frame mediated between fiction and reality, protected the picture and the fictional space that it contained, and facilitated its legibility in and distance from real space. But once the fictional space of representation had been rejected, as in most abstract painting, and in the works of Mondrian and Malevich specifically, the frame served no purpose. In the abstract structures of the Russians and Soviets, the elimination of the vase suggested a move away from the conventions of a sculptor, mass, volume. At the same time, with the relaxation of artistic codes that the dismissal of the frame and the base signified, these works approach the status of ordinary objects and abandon the space of representation. Goulard concluded, quote, "Contemporary painting and sculpture converge at a common point, increasingly distant from their origins. They become special objects, non-objects, for which the denominations of painting and sculpture might not be appropriate." End quote. Now, without Goulard's follow-up essay, Dialogue of the Non-Object, and that's not it, but I'll talk about the comic on the bottom in a moment. And this Dialogue of the Non-Object was published a few months later. And without it, again, with this follow-up, the initial short text is prophetic but incomplete, raising more questions than it answers. The longer dialogue, an imaginary interview between Goulard and an unidentified interlocutor, delves deeper into the philosophical and aesthetic roots of the non-object. It attempts to provide answers to what must have seemed to many readers of the Theory of the Non-Object a riddle and a sarcastic affront. Indeed, two cartoons made by the Brazilian illustrator Fortuna on one of the foldouts that served as a catalog for the second exhibition of neo-concrete art in December of 1960 depicts onlookers at the exhibition pondering what the non-object is, and this is the cartoon on the bottom, how it relates, how it can be made, how one should interact with it, and how it relates to ordinary things and traditional sculpture. The cartoons poke fun at the existential tenor of the term non-object and the confusing terminology proposed by Lydia Clark's Bichos, and this is the name of a series of works produced in 1960 And these blur the boundaries, these bichos, which translates as critters, these blur the boundaries between artworks and objects. I'm sorry, between, at least nominally, between artworks and critters, just as the non-object blur the boundaries between artworks and objects. And therein lies the kernel of the riddle. Goulart instead insisted that although the non-object transcended the conventional categories of painting and sculpture, it was not an ordinary object. To substantiate his claims, Goulart turned to phenomenology, proposing that these naked objects, objects lacking the definitional markers of the base and the frame, aspired to produce models of signification or modes of signification that rejected a priori meanings and resulted instead from the work's appearance in the spectator's field of vision, a return to the thing itself that implied a realization outside the conventions of art. So a return to the object itself, to the thing itself, was to also, right, reject the conventions of what we understand as painting and sculpture. It was a move towards the thing itself, to the materiality of the object, that was to happen at the same time that one rejected what one knows about painting and sculpture, right? And this was aided by the rejection of the frame and the base. This mode of signification, Goulart argued, made the non-object transparent to perception, not so much to cognition, but to perception, right? We don't need knowledge, we just need to perceive the object, right? We don't need mediation. We don't need the frame, we don't need the base. We don't need we don't need knowledge of the object. We don't need frame or base. We don't need conceptual backing. Ordinary objects, by contrast, require language to be recognized, as they are exhausted, their meaning foreclosed, by their utility and linguistic designation. This is why, Goulart explained, quote, when we withdraw from the cultural order of the world, we see objects without name, and we confront the opacity of things. The object becomes an absurd presence, opaque, with which perception clashes, end quote. However, what applies to these ordinary objects without name does not apply to neo-concrete works. The non-object does not have that opacity, he wrote. The non-object is transparent to perception. Of course, how are we going to confront the ordinary object? How are we going to withdraw the ordinary object from culture? I mean, can we even do that, right? I mean, he doesn't propose how we actually would encounter, how would we be in that situation. But he's very clear that when we face a non-object or a neo-concrete work, that work is transparent to perception. It is unique in our phenomenal world and conducive to the suspension of knowledge and to the experience of astonishment, because it is free from the attachments to the world of language and use. Clearly, this was idealistic, but it corresponds to the Brazilians' desire to break away from the habits of language and form that stale our perceptions and understandings of the world, to break away from assertive, normative, definable form to occupy the realm of relations and temporality, the space of dissipation in which form recommences anew with each perception. Again, an idealistic endeavor or quest, but that was what they were trying to do, to encounter form anew with each perception. The non-object announced the collapse of the modernist, here's some, by the way, some Lydia Clark critters I was talking about before. The non-object announced the collapse of the modernist paradigm of aesthetic self-referentiality and universal signification that concrete art entailed, though it did not avoid contradictions in doing so. Caught between the realms of art and reality, the non-object manifested a sort of identity crisis of the artwork. I always say to my students that the non-object is like a painting or a sculpture that has lost its social security card, right? No frame, no base. It's a bit of it's the kind of an identity. What Goulart is mapping is a bit of an identity crisis of the artwork. the artwork without its, its markers. It signaled a radical recasting of the ontological project of definition that had characterized modernist painting, and that Goulart associated with concrete art's emphasis on the self-referential nature of the artwork, constituted by its plastic elements alone. And he was not thinking about Greenberg, he's thinking about Van Desburg, right, who in 1930 says that the painting is made of line and color, and that's what constitutes the essence of a painting, that it doesn't have to tell a story, it forbids anecdote and narrative. So there is the Theo Van Desburg concrete art notion of medium specificity, which is different and prior to that of Clement Greenberg in the United States, and asserts flatness as the essence of painting. So let me next pursue further the figure of the non-object as a model conceptual tool that might allow us to understand the alternative epistemology deployed by artists and critics in Brazil during this period of intense experimentation. Ultimately, it was experimentation what Hélio Oiticica saw as the urgent task of the avant-garde in an underdeveloped country. This task of experimentation was intimately related to a rejection of representation, and not just pictorial representation. Representation as the act of defining, of categorizing, of dominating, of identifying, of setting forth in front of oneself. Take Oiticica's use of the word structure to delineate the non-referential operation of mediation that his work embodied. And I'm trying to kind of establish a bit of a parallel here between the non-object and its non-definitional enterprise and the term structure as Oiticica used it in his writings. Structure in Oiticica's writings might refer to his early plastic production, and here are some works that were talked about in those terms, and structure in this body of work allowed for a redefinition of the plastic elements of the work in such a way that they abandoned the wall and around which the viewer moved, and this is what he called as, a spatial-temporal structure. So structure is the way he redefines and reconfigures the materialities of painting, the materiality of painting, the support, and the painting itself, right? Or a structure might refer to the mode in which artists redefine the constructive legacies in general. Against a simple reassessment of the Russian constructivism he clearly admired, Oiticica wrote, quote, I consider then constructive artists those who establish new structural relations in painting, color, and in sculpture, and open new perceptions of time and space. So structure was a way of redefining the materials of painting in new ways. In this reconsidered meaning of the constructive, Oiticica underlined, echoing the logic of the non-object, experiments in relief that explore, quote, the spatial structural problem in a half-term between painting and space, end quote. Structure allowed Oiticica to keep the objectifying of representation at bay by alluding to action and the consequent shattering of contemplation. The structural disturbed the process through which the spectator, argued Oiticica, searched for the ideal form that would resolve the classical opposition between subject and object. So I guess in some way what I'm trying to suggest is that the non-object, structure, this broader understanding of the constructive attempted to reject ideal form that would suggest, again, some stable ontology, right? Some stable core for the work. I quote Oiticica again, form was then anxiously sought and sculpted to produce something eternal, infinite, and immovable within the finite, changing world of phenomena. That's what he wanted to counter, this idea of searching for something eternal. And representation, of course, would be also such process. Representation would be conducive to that search for the ideal form. By 1964, when Oiticica was in the midst of his most anti-aesthetic work, the Parangoles, sorry, some other works, here, so Oiticica in 64, with a work from 64. And these are called Parangoles, produced in the context of the favela of Mangueira, and in relation to heated debates about popular culture and a straightforward representation versus abstraction. At this point, structure was used to refer to the way in which this body of work negotiated its dialogue with its environment, with the favela, the shantytown, samba, carnival, as well as with the popular realm of festivities, fairs, shacks, and decorations that he invoked in his seminal text, Fundamental Basis for a Definition of the Parangolé. As he stated towards the end of that text, quote, "To find elements of Parangolé in the landscape of the urban-rural world is also part of establishing perceptive structural relations between what grows in the structural greed of the Parangolé, representing here the general character of color structure in environmental space, and what is found in the spatial environmental world." And Oiticica's writings can be a little wordy sometimes, but what he's trying to say is that his relationship to the environment is not mimetic, clearly, it's not representational, it's not simply appropriation, but that it's mediated by this concept of a structure, and that it is what allows him to relate to the environment while reconfigure, again, color structure. And what defines this creative process is encounter with the environment. That, again, is not mimetic, it's not representational, and it's not simply appropriation. Uncompromising in his total commitment to the experimental, Oiticica decried a facile folkloric reading of this work and of its materials. In the artist's words, quote, "The artist does not subjectively superimpose content. It is in the artist's dialogue with the material that his creative that his creativity can be found. And from there, that indeterminate, unformulated content is born." So this is, this is the creative process for him. It's not imposing your subjectivity on what you encounter or on the environment or on the object. It is a dialogue with the materials that will formulate, that will produce something indeterminate and unformulated. And this unformulated content, of course, is related to the non-object, something that is outside conventions, something that is experimental. So structure was really a way of not letting the materials be identified with an a priori meaning. So this is not identifiable with samba or the shanty towns because it was produced there. It's a way of like making the materials produce, again, an alternative form, a new form, which is also why the word invention is very important for Oiticica around this time. So these conceptual acrobatics went hand in hand with the notion of work environment, obra ambiente, characterized by the experience of collective participation. These environmental totalities would be created and explored in all their dimensions, quote, "from the infinitely small to architectonic urban space," end quote. And here I'm showing you some images of such collective event. It's an event entitled or called Apocalipopotisi. It was a manifestation on the outside of the Museum of Modern Art of Rio de Janeiro, which involved the participation of several artists, samba dancers, musicians. It was a kind of really interdisciplinary happening, engaging with popular culture and again, this is also happening, this outside of the museum is also happening in the context of a tightening dictatorship, which by '68 had really compromised this concept of, or this identification between progressive art and democracy, say. Under the aegis of the environmental, Oiticica would embark on his own redefinition of the object. In 1963, he had borrowed from Mario Pedrosa the term trans-object, coined in 1960. And he used this term trans-object to talk about his voliges, which are works that I hope you saw in the exhibition, consisting of painted boxes with compartments and sliding doors that incorporated materials such as pebbles, pigments, mirrors, and pieces of mesh fabric. They also included glass vessels and bottles that contained shells, pigments, and colored liquids. But by 1968, Oiticica was privileging another contribution to this lively Brazilian conversation around the nature of the art object. And that's Rogério Duarte's notion of the pro-object. Sorry, I don't want to complicate things, but what can I say? So, according to Oiticica, pro-object referred to the probabilities of the object as a probability. Quote, not the result of one probability, but the potentiality for a probability, end quote. This can be many, clarified Oiticica, and insisting on the plural, he wrote, quote, here the probability is a collective term that can turn into many things, end quote. The name, he wrote, had arrived just in time. It suited his distrust in the work of art as static, timeless, and closed, self-sufficient, and representative of an idea. This idea of the work representing an idea was also anathema to Oiticica. Thus also the notion of anti-art mobilized the year before, and accounted instead for an emphasis on process and duration. And he wrote on what I call vivencias, which translates as life experiences. Which here he defined as an affective configuration, feelings that emerge with ideas, quote, and the participation in those ideas as they are communicated into propositions. So the term proposition here is important because it had been used already by Leah Clark to talk about works that completely did away with the object, completely did away with the self-sufficiency of the object in favor of action and the performative. Oiticica indicated that a turn to objects was linked to the act of creation conceived as a process rather than to the notion of representation. He wrote, quote, appropriated objects, metaphoric objects, structural objects, objects that demand to be manipulated, etc. are born. We turned our attention to actions on the environment, where objects exist as signals and not simply as works. The character of signal is absorbed and transformed as well in the elapsing of experiences, since now it is the action or a behavioral exercise what becomes important, end quote. The object was thus a trigger, and it did not necessarily imply a traditional materiality. A scream, a sound, wrote Oiticica, could be considered an object. It is a discovery of the world in each instant, he formulated. And expanding the existential tenor of neoconcretism, Oiticica added that this discovery of the world was also a discovery, quote, of the ethical, social, political dimension of man, to wit, of life as a perpetual creative manifestation, end quote. In the remaining time we have left, I'll jump via the pro-object from the non-object to the quasi-object in a very speculative gesture that aspires to occupy a methodological in-between. As I move from the specific context of Brazil in the 60s to the global contemporary, or full circle back to Paris, but through the front door. The quasi-object entered very recently in my intellectual field of vision via the work of French artist Philippe Parreno. He has used the term, borrowed from French philosopher Michel Serres, to define hybrid arrangements of objects and sound events that clearly defy material and formal stability as are objects and can be arranged to produce different configurations. The quasi-object is Sarrè's pièce de résistance in an intellectual endeavor that favors relations to dismiss the great themes of philosophy: being, essence, consciousness, but also ideas, categories, concepts, and objects. All these stands for an outdated philosophical system, he argues, classifications which imply exclusions. The quasi-object acquires meaning according to the network of relations in which it finds itself inserted. Serres avails himself of many other terms that avoid the teleologies of modernity with which we still associate contemporary art. Topology, for example, is mobilized to talk about crumpling and foldable diversities that bypass fixed form, temporalities that reject linearity. Between, for example, also is a prime preposition. It allows for interdisciplinary thinking, for entangled and threaded space and time, for fluid and frail syntheses that counteract academic divisions. Quote, "The passage is natural," writes Serres, "and the obstacle is artificial." Or as he also indicates, quote, "A preposition does not transport messages. It indicates a network of possible paths, either in space or in time," end quote. Relations but not fragments, which are resistant. Museums, he reminds us, are stuffed with objects, with fragments, disparate members. This is conservative, he argues, and one can add that it partakes in the classificatory system of hierarchies and exclusions that refuses to see the whole, however fragile and vulnerable this whole is. The synthesizing element, he told Bruno Latour in a book-length conversation, is relations. This synthesis, he clarified, is not a system, and it never abandons local, quote, radical pluralism, end quote. Influenced by questions of turbulence, percolation, disorder, and chaos, the synthesis Serres aims for is fluid. It concerns the interdisciplinary ground that rejects academic divisions and favors passages in order to constantly invent. Quote, "I think victorially," he told Latour, quote, "vector, vehicle, sense, direction, the trajectory of time, the index of movement or of transformation," end quote. There are no beginnings or origins, unique principles or closed systems, foundations or fixed points. Echoing the epistemological trajectories that I've been tracing above, Serres mobilizes meta-languages which disrespect a sustained method, so that each time he can adapt to a localized problem from where the localized method will emerge. Forget disciplines, he says. Quote, "There are simply bodies of text, situations, places, objects," end quote. In relations, all of these in relations, rapports, not ontology, but trajectories and movement from place to place. The ball is place, writes Serres, introducing the mundane object around which a collectivity of players position themselves, converting the ball into a subject, a quasi-object. Quote, "It is like a tracker of the relations in the fluctuating collectivity around it," end quote. Quasi-object would designate that ambivalence between subject and object, I and we. It is the passing, the elasticity, the relation between one and the other. The quasi-object operates according to context and it decenters. Participation, writes Serres, quote, "is the passing of the I by passing. It is the abandon of my individuality or my being in a quasi-object that is there only to be circulated. It is rigorously the transubstantiation of being into relation," end quote. So enter Pareno, whose work in the last 10 years or so has favored the exhibition as a medium. The exhibition populated by a variety of quasi-objects, images, props, soundscapes, and people. And these photographs that I'm going to show you now are from Pareno's Hypnosis, a work exhibition that occupied the vast space of New York Park Avenue Armory during June of 2015. Here's one. There's a film at the end, and these a number of these so-called marquees, and this is a closer shot of that film, but there were several films shown at the time, and here is another shot of that. And there's piano playing. I have a couple of clips. Let me see if we have time. How are we with time? Yeah? Okay. So, enter Pareno, whose work in the last 10 years or so has favored the exhibition as a medium. And that's what I'm suggesting here. He's very vocal about that he's not using discrete objects, that he's not producing discrete objects, but creating these environments. And this, in 2015, was Pareno's second largest and most explicit attempt to consider the exhibition as a medium, as an object of sorts, rather than a collection of individual works. This object, though, was clearly not a conventional object, as the object exhibition that hypnosis represented was permeated by temporalities, devices, and modalities of interaction that bring to bear a whole set of concepts closer to theater, film, or attempts at a synthesis of the arts, event, choreography, experience. Pareno situates the seed of these experiments in relation to a larger conversation about the nature of art that he has sustained with colleagues since the 90s. Accordingly, in several recent occasions, Pareno has mobilized the concept of the quasi-object to shed light on his working process and the specific relational dynamics that his own objects stage in the exhibition space. Like the quasi-object, which is defined by context and creates, through gestures and actions, a collectivity around it, so can art function. Accordingly, Pareno stated in 2013, quote, "There's always for me the pleasure of taking an object and not reinventing it, but renegotiating the way it becomes public, which is what I think the idea of the exhibition is all about. It's the negotiation that allows a form to become public," end quote. A related aesthetic inquiry has followed, as a main preoccupation for Pareno has been how to make the exhibition a creative act in the same way that a choreography, a piece of theater, a film can be. His answer has been to operate as a metteur en scène, developing precise scores for the objects, images, props, and sounds that make up his contemporary Gesamtkunstwerks. Quote, "I'm fascinated by the moment where things don't stop but drain from one world to another," end quote. This 2013 statement may well be the key to understand his interest in processes of destabilization that obliterate any possibility of rest for the objects and the subjects implicated in the scored spaces that he orchestrates. So let me show a clip. Can we show that clip? Let me show quickly a clip, if it's available. Let me see. One of these two, whichever, it's okay. Thank you. That's fine. Yeah, just play. Thank you. So yeah, let me just, I have a couple of clips, so let me show you at least one. So it's not as static. So let me talk over these. I think we can. The music is going to start. So 2 years before, he had argued, 2 years after this statement from 2013 about, this idea of things not stopping but draining from one world to another, which is exactly what happens in these installations. There's electronic music, then it'll go into piano soundscape. There's a feed of the noises from the street, while there's this flickering going on these marquees, while soon we will see the screen materializing an image from a film. So there's this, again, constant drainage from image to object to sound, etc. 2 years before, he had argued, following Sarret, that the quasi-object was both being and relation, or we might say being in relation. And this relation, this ritual, changed the object exhibited, so that the object and exhibition could not be differentiated. Like ritualistic objects, the quasi-object, or these quasi-objects, images, props, devices, sound, and the whole dramaturgical apparatus of mobility and passage would compromise the integrity of identity. As curator Carlos Basualdo, in conversation with the artist, expressed, quote, "What attracts me to this work," and he's talking about the marquise that you see here, is that it brings out the question of an intermediary status for certain objects in the show. We could call them quasi-works because their status as artworks is suspended, end quote. So I'd like to suggest that the prefix quasi, from the Latin as if, almost, allows Pareno to negotiate the ambiguity of passage that his installations are so keen to convey. In this sense, Pareno's rituals are the opposite of worship rites or religious ceremonies. They don't involve formal gestures, traditional rules, invariants, nor do they assert social identities, hierarchies, or boundaries. They also counter the secular rituals that museums and traditional art spaces deploy through carefully staged objects which demand an equally structured behavior. If the latter evolved in the 20th century into spectatorial models of intense absorption, where the world outside would be kept at bay to facilitate pure aesthetic contemplation, one can see Pareno's quasi-objects commanding modes of attention and distraction that instead refuse to settle. In Pareno's work, objects do not belong here or there, are not these or that. Indeed, the same year Jaron Lanier invented virtual reality, Pareno acknowledged the fact in a short text entitled "No More Reality." This is 1991. There he wrote, quote, "In a certain sense, we can read current events like a scenario," end quote. And exhibition spaces, too, he will retort later, with the development of an artistic practice that abandoned the notion of the autonomous art object in favor of treating the exhibition, the material artifacts that it contained, the images that it projected, the display devices and cinematic dimensions that it mobilized, its audience, its architectural site, as a malleable form, as a malleable material. The latter resists identity and definition, and as Pareno has observed in many occasions, favors the slippage of one thing into another, one situation into another, or of object into situation, reality into fiction, viewer into collectivity. More than a medium, we might think of a space environments marked by a multiplicity of forms that, through attention and distraction, emerge and dissolve. If the non-object suggests the oceanic field of differentiation from which the marked form might emerge, I'd like to adopt the suggestion that the quasi-object is the marker of relations, defining objects and subjects according to how it moves and activates space. The particular qualities of the quasi-objects, writes Stephen Brown, are unimportant because it is undetermined. He writes, "This quasi-object, when being passed, makes the collective. If it stops, it makes the individual," end quote. To us, attempting to intervene in the elusive global contemporary, the quasi-object and the non-object signal a relational methodology, a practice of vectors and reticles, of fluidity and non-identity, where alternative forms and materials demand the audacity of weak systems. Thank you. I'll leave it here. And this is slower than I thought, but now a film pops up on the screen.
46,000.
And you might recognize this is like a famous
design character company,
film by Parreno from 1995
like some others in the catalog.
called Anne Lee.
Proposed a cartoon.
All right, I'll leave it there.